All right, so we have a small group today, currently conflicting with Tahoe Dreamin' as well as the admin Spring 18 preview. But nevertheless, we're going to move forward. This is the 34th automation hour. So I have with me here my co-host David Litton. Rakesh is home in India, so we're missing him for this one. And we have Francis, who will be our guest presenter today. So if you're joining us for the first time, all lines will be muted. If you have questions about Francis's presentation or a general process automation question, do use the chat function and we'll get to your questions at a certain point during the presentation. We will be posting the recording on our success community, Trailblazer community, Salesforce Automation Hour, on our website, automationhour.com, and we will be also sharing that via Twitter as well. All right, so Francis will round off the end of our advanced series that we started off last year, and then we have a lot of great presenters lined up until the month of June. So all these links will be available once we post the deck, or go to Automation Hour upcoming webinars and register for them. I do want to make a special note for our February 16th event. We do have the Salesforce Product Manager for Process Automation. Alex will be presenting the Spring 18 automation features, so definitely register for that. And you could ask questions directly to the product manager. Shout out to Concrete.io for continuing to support us in this free webinar series, and that we could just bring great content to the community. And here are your co-hosts, David, myself, and Rakesh. This was taken at the most recent Dreamforce. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Francis. Francis is a two-time now Automation Hour presenter. He's also a fellow MVP. So let me hand that over to Francis.
Awesome, brilliant. So hi, everybody. So my name is Francis Pindar. I basically work as a technical architect for Next Stronghold UK, which is a Salesforce consultancy that I run, as well as I was co-founder of aforce.guru, which is now acloudguru, and we kind of train around 350,000 people on Salesforce and AWS online. I'm a 5-time Salesforce MVP. I do blogs, YouTube channel as well as organising London's Calling, which is kind of like a dreaming event, but based in London, which is almost sold out. So if you're in London, grab some tickets quick. I think there's about 14 tickets left, which is pretty cool. And also I'm a presenter at Dreamforce and World Tour and other European tech events around the world, as well as a trustee for a charity in the UK. Okay, so what we're going to do today is, so basically I did a session last time about the developer console, and basically this is basically a quick recap of that, but also I'm going to go into a bit more detail on the debug logs and how you can read them, because some people said that was going to be quite interesting. But focusing just on flow and process builder, of course, and not any other bits within the debug logs. And then go over a very quick best practice. And if you've got any questions at the end, then sure, give me a shout at the end. Okay, so this is all about what happens when you save a record in Salesforce. So I've got this Burlington Textiles Corp of America account, and if I hit save, what happens? And basically the debug log and developer console allows you to kind of interrogate and have a look at the log and see what is happening under the hood within Salesforce. So if you've got processes or workflows that you think should have fired and haven't fired, you can use the debug log to kind of interrogate Salesforce and say, hey, why didn't you run it? As well as seeing what actions have fired off or not, as the case may be. And so the developer console is a really great tool for seeing all this stuff. But it actually does a load of other things as well. So it's not just looking at logs. You can navigate source code, you can do testing, validation, all kinds of this, and then executing SOQL and queries and things like that. So it's all kind of very developy, but these are the kind of core things that we're going to be looking at. or I think it's important for admins. And what we're going to focus really in this call is the debugging and troubleshooting, viewing those logs. So we get an understanding of what how to read these logs, what to ignore, and what to kind of drill into, and what's important. So I saved that record in Salesforce, but what does Salesforce actually do? So there's a whole load of steps that Salesforce goes through when you hit save on a record, or even when you're creating a record. And this is called the Salesforce execution order. So all this, we went into this in a lot more detail in the talk previously. So I will just kind of skim over it a little bit. But basically, when you hit save, Salesforce basically first checks for validation rules, and if they all pass, it's going to move on to see if there's any before Apex triggers, and if there's any before Apex triggers, it's going to run those, and if there's any errors, it's just going to stop and not continue, and it'll carry on doing all these different steps. And then you'll see at the bottom we've got it executing the rules and executing processes. So these are it could be assignment rules, workflow rules, and also executing flows and process builder processes. So these are the bits we're going to really kind of drill into in a minute. But there are loads more steps. There are about 20 more steps, and I go into more detail in the other video, so do check it out. But how do you get into this developer console? Now, it all depends on if you're using the classic UI or the Lightning UI. So if you're using the classic UI, it's quite easy. You just click your name and click Developer Console. And if you're using the Lightning UI, you just click the cog and click Developer Console. And this basically pings up a separate window. So you've now got your Salesforce in one browser, and this is a separate window that's popped up as well. And basically, you need to keep this running in the background. So it's kind of recording the things that you're doing in your Salesforce org. And you can see here, it's got some menus along the top, the file, edit, debug, test, and workspace. And along the bottom, we got some tabs, logs, tests, checkpoints, and things like that. But we're pretty much just going to leave it as it is. And now what we're going to do is we're just going to go back to my record. And I'm going to edit that record, and then I'm just going to click save on it again. Now, what has happened? Now, I'm actually going to tell you what's actually happened behind the scenes, because it will make it a lot more easy to understand what's going on if I tell you now, and then we can kind of go through it through the debug log. So basically, I've got 4 different things on the account object. I've got one workflow rule. And this workflow rule is called data check +5. And what this rule is doing, it's basically checking the record to see if the billing address and the city are blank. And basically, after 5 days, it will then send an email to the account owner if those fields are still blank, saying, hey, these fields are blank, you need to update them. So pretty simple. Next one is a update all account contacts process builder process. And what this is doing is basically it's looking at the account, seeing if the do not call field on the account record equals true. And if so, it's then going to cascade down and update all the contacts and set their do not call to true as well. Pretty straightforward. And then we've got 2 more process builders. Processes, one that creates an op if this UHD op field is true. And the final one is update contacts, which is very similar to the do not call update. All it's doing is if the account type is set to prospect, it's then going to update all the contacts to prospect as well. Now, these are all active in Salesforce on the object, but the second one, the update all account contacts, is the only one where the criteria is going to evaluate true and it's actually going to run. Okay, so all the others are not going to run, but the update all account contacts process builder process will, based on the criteria within them. So just a quick look at the workflow rule. So this is it. It's just saying, is the billing address blank, and is this the billing city address blank? If so, then you're going to fire the actions. And then on the process builder process, that's is again, all it's doing is it's very simple. We've got the account object. it's looking at that do not call field on the account object. If it's set to true, it just does an immediate action to update all the child contacts on the account object, or sorry, that relate to the account object. Hopefully that all makes sense. That's all pretty straightforward. So I've edited that record, I've clicked save, and now I'm going to have a look at the debug log and what it has in there. And you'll see now it's got a load more rows appearing at the bottom. Now, because I saved it within Lightning, each one of these logs along the bottom, so there's 5 of them, each one of those pretty much corresponds to a different component within the user interface. And basically, to figure out which one it is, you generally just have to look at the one with the biggest size. So the one at the bottom where it says 16.33 kilobytes, that is my debug log I want to take a look at. Now, if you're in the classic UI, you might find you get less, or maybe even only one debug log. And it's slightly easier to figure out which debug log you need to load up, because this is the record ID of the record that I click save on, and this /e basically says it's kind of an edit operation that I was performing. And of course, you can see actually the size is pretty big as well. So actually that's the debug log that I'm after. So I'm going to double click on that bottom debug log there, and up pops the debug log. So this is all those actions, also all those steps that I showed you earlier on, Salesforce going through them all and basically logging the output of what it found. So as I've got no code in there, I haven't got any kind of validation rules that have failed or any validation rules that are being evaluated. Literally all I've got is workflow rules and process builder processes. This is all that it's displaying in here. Now it's still very texty. And so there is a quick way you can see if there's anything else firing off, like code or anything like that. And that's if you dive up to the menu debug and click switch perspective, and then click the analysis option on here, you can get a quick view of what's going on. So the debug log is kind of whizzed up to that top right-hand corner of the screen, but in the middle, you can kind of ignore this up here, but here we've got this thing called a save order. And you can see here that it's just performing, Salesforce is only performing an action on the account, which is an edit action, which I kind of performed. And all it's doing is some workflow. So it's either workflow, process builder, process stuff, or flows going on. And that's it. And if there was code or anything else in there, I would see that displayed in here. So if I double click on that kind of purple bar, I basically get this box appearing, hopefully, yes, box appearing. And it basically shows you the different process builder processes and workflows that have been evaluated, and if they've been evaluated true and false. Now you can see that the data check, this is the validation rule, has been evaluated false, and that's true, that's correct. So it's not going to fire any actions from that workflow rule. But you can see that these 3 are actually the process builder process, and they say that they've all evaluated true, which is a bit of a lie. So I will come to that, back to that in a moment. But this can look really awesome. So if you've got loads of code and you want to see why an update of an account should affect, say, a case or a contact, this is an example that I used in the previous webinar. And you can see that actually this, from the updating of the account, some code fired off, it's updated some cases, then some more code fired off on the account, which then updated some more cases, then some workflow or process builder processes fired off, and that's updated some contacts. And so you can kind of visualize a little bit what's going on underneath the hood in Salesforce. But let's dive back to our record that we updated. And I'm just going to flick back to the debug log, because that's what we want to kind of dig into in a little more detail. So debug, switch perspective, log only, to flick back to that log view. And there we are, we're back to this log view. Now, there's one thing that I do is basically make this column a bit wider, because at the moment it's kind of truncating and chopping off the end of these event names. So the first thing I do is just dive up to this bar and drag it across, just so we can see these event names. Now, there will be a lot of event names potentially in your org. So this is all about drilling into the ones that are relevant to you. And so if you're looking for a specific event name, you can type it in this filter here, and it will filter and try and find it within your debug log. But let's kind of go through this now and see what's going on. So at the top, we have it's saying WF workflow eval begin. This is basically telling you that Salesforce is about to start evaluating all the workflows and process builder processes. So we move to the next one, which is WF criteria begin. And this is basically saying that Salesforce is now evaluating the criteria of a particular rule. And it tells you what that workflow rule or process builder name is. So it's saying it's running it on this record, and there's the record ID. And it's the process builder process it's running is this: update all account contacts. Now, I know it's a process builder process because the name has an ID attached straight after it, before this bar here that you can see here. So I know that this is a process builder process. And if we come down to the next line here, where it says WF criteria begin, we can see another process builder process, because I know its name has an ID after it and then a bar. And then the same thing again, update contacts, the name, and then a bar. And then finally, we have the data check plus 5 days, and it's got the bar immediately. So I know that this is my validation rule. So if we take a look at this validation rule in a little more detail, you'll see it's straight under here. It says WF formula. Now, this is the entry criteria, if I kind of pop in the workflow rule details for that particular workflow rule. So you can see, essentially, it looks pretty much the same as what you typed out. It has got this kind of crazy ID colon, but you can kind of ignore that. But basically, it's saying, this is your formula field. But what's really cool is it basically tells you what the values of the record were when it was evaluating this entry criteria. So you can see that the billing address has got a billing address and the billing city has got a city. And that evaluated, if you look on the very left side where it says WF criteria end, it evaluated false. So Salesforce is saying that the billing address is not blank, and the billing city is not blank. Therefore, I'm not going to run this workflow process, which is all kind of cool. But if we take a look at the process builder processes, you can see here the WF criteria end is also saying true, which you might think is, oh, it's evaluated the criteria of my process builder process and it's going to fire the actions. Well, that's not the case. This is because Flow technically isn't on the Salesforce platform. It's kind of within it, but it's not quite completely on the platform. So this is basically just telling Salesforce that it needs to go off and run your flow or your process builder process. And so you can basically ignore these, and I'll show you where you can see the criteria in a sec. But let's just review these events so you kind of get a little list of what you're kind of looking at. So these are the ones that you're going to look for. Now, I've also put a link here to all the different events that you can get within the debug log. So you can see all the potential, and it gives you a little bit of a description of what they do and what they're supposed to show. So we've got the WF rule eval begin, which is the beginning of the workflow rule or process rule process. We've got the criteria begin, which is telling you what the rule name is. We've got the WF formula, which is the source and the values of your evaluation rule. And then you've got the criteria end, which, if it's a workflow, will give you the true evaluation of that formula field, the entry criteria. But if it's a flow, it's lying. It's just going to fire the process builder process. So what does it look like as if when your process builder process fires off? So it's been told it needs to run these process builder processes. So if we scroll down a bit further in the debug log, so this is literally just underneath that workflow rule evaluation, you can see here there's loads of kind of event names called flow create, flow start, flow value, flow rule detail, all these kind of things. Now, there's a whole list of these flow flow event types, and these are some of them that are kind of useful to kind of keep an eye out on. So flow rule is that criteria. So the evaluating the criteria of your process builder process. Then anything that says like flow element and something, or flow element, so anything that's like flow element is basically saying that your process builder process is creating a record or updating a record. And then anything that says flow action call is basically a post, a chat, submitting an approval, email alerts, firing off other flows or other processes. And one thing I find really handy is the flow wait. So this is basically saying that you've got a scheduled action in your process builder process, and it's fired off and puts that action in the queue. So you don't have to wait like an hour or 2 days or whatever for that record to create within Salesforce. If it is a record creation or whatever it is, or whatever the scheduled job is, you can basically see that it's kind of been put in the queue and it has passed the criteria in your process builder process and got to that action that needs to be scheduled. So that's kind of a handy one I kind of keep an eye out for. But if we dive back to the debug log, and in here, you can basically see the first thing I kind of have a hunt out for is this create interview begin. So this is basically saying, this is initiating the start of evaluating all the process builder processes. And then directly under that, or a bit further down, you have this start interview begin, which is basically saying that the flow or your process builder process, which is called create UHD, has just kicked off, and it's going to evaluate to see which criterias are going to be true, and therefore which actions it's going to fire off. So this is the beginning of the create UHD flow, and this is the one that isn't going to do anything because the criteria isn't going to match. Now, this row here, it's quite a cool little row. This is where it says my variable current. It basically gives you a list of all the fields and all the field values of that particular record that it's evaluating at that particular time. And you can double click on it and have a look at all those field values because it's kind of gone off the line. You can do this with any of the lines, just double click on it and take a look. Which is kind of useful because it might be that you have code or other workflows or something else that has happened that's updated that record to a different value. And by the time it gets to your process builder process, something's changed it so it doesn't go into and fire off your flow or your process builder process. But the really important thing is a little bit further down, and this is where it says my rule 1. And this is basically saying that in your process builder process called create UHD, that it's basically run the criteria for this rule 1, and it's decided that it's false. So whatever that criteria is on the create UHD, which is basically saying, is that field ticked and therefore create an opportunity, that field is not ticked because it's evaluated false. So it's not going to fire any actions for this particular rule, as in for rule number 1. So if I whiz down, here's another scenario. So this is basically, I've just whizzed down the debug log a little bit further down, and you can see that this, where it says flow start interval begin, is the start of the update all accounts process builder process. And in the same way, you still get the my variable current, so you can see all the field values for that particular record that it's evaluating at the moment. But if you scroll down a bit further down here, you can see that the flow rule detail is now saying rule 1 is true. So it's now saying that criteria for that rule at the beginning of the update all account contacts process builder process has now been evaluated true. So it's now going to fire the actions off for that process builder process. And if you see here, it's saying my rule underscore A1. So it's, my rule underscore A1 is saying this group of actions that you've got for that rule is now going to fire off. Yeah, so it's got to the actions within your process builder process for the first rule, and it's going to fire those group of actions off. And you can see here on the very next line, it says flow record update, my rule 1, A1. So you can see that actually for the first rule, it's got an action on there, and within that action group, there's a record update action being performed. So you know that now the process builder process is updating those records, and everything is good. Okay, so that is a bit of a whistle-stop tour of a little bit more detail of how you can kind of debug a flow and an or a process builder process, and seeing the values and seeing if it's going into those actions, if it's kind of evaluating those criterias in the rules within your process builder or not. So you can kind of get an idea of what's going on. Now, because it is slightly off platform, you don't get the kind of degree of detail that you do with a workflow rule. So you can't see like, there's the formula that I've got in my criteria and this is the results of it. But you can increase the debug log level, which I did in the previous talk, mentioned about that. And that actually gives you more detail on what's going on in your flow. And Salesforce is every release kind of continually improving it and giving more and more information into the debug log so you can see what's going on, which is kind of cool as well. So the best practices basically for flow and kind of being able to see this stuff is, one of them is make sure you don't have the process builder firing off all the time. If you can at least limit it to only firing off when you need to. So this rule, the update all account contacts, basically the rule is saying if the tick box is true, just fire it off every time, update all the records regardless. So if anybody updates that account, it's going to cascade and update all those contacts every single time. And it may be that this actually, and this is essentially slows Salesforce down. You've got a potential of hitting limits, and it all gets a little bit messy. So what you can do is basically start using is changed or on record creation. So it's basically saying that for that checkbox, so if I tick that checkbox, which said, I can't remember what it was, do not call on the account, and then it cascades down and updates all those accounts. Use the is changed to say, if the do not call on the account is changed, then update all the contacts. But if it hasn't changed, then don't, because then it will speed Salesforce up and you'll save yourself a lot of pain and sorrow. And you can just do that by diving in, and rather than using equals, just use the is changed option. Even if it's a pick list value, if it's a Boolean value or whatever it is, it can be anything you like. And then also the only update when it is created. So then you're only kind of firing all these rules off when it's created as well. So it's basically limiting the amount of times your process builder processes are going to fire, so it doesn't get in a bit of a tangle. And with that, that is it. So we did do the webinar last time, so check that out for a bit more detail on kind of navigating around Developer Console, as well as that kind of different view. But also I've done a course which goes into a free course that you can kind of download and access. I just go into that bit.ly link so you can kind of get into a bit more detail. And also I've got my YouTube channel. Just search for my name on YouTube, which I kind of post little random videos on. But that's about it. So has anybody got any questions?
I don't see any open questions right now, but I think we had a pretty good question that would be great to make sure we include on the recording. And the question, I'll let you answer it. Is it correct that the rules are numbered in order creation and not necessarily the order they are visually in the process builder editor?
Yeah, so it's based on the creation, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, so you got to watch that.
So yeah, if you rearrange your process builder criteria nodes around, then you're gonna potentially lose track of which one it actually is. So that's one negative right now of rearranging the nodes, is you could kind of get confused which one's actually being referred to.
Yeah, I'm hoping that, if you do, you know, the Salesforce is going to start putting in like the names of them and stuff like that to make it a lot easier to kind of view them. And once that happens, it's going to be great. But at the moment, yeah, it's a little bit tricky.
Okay. And we got another question. Does Francis ever use Chatter or a Chatter group to work as sort of a console written in to reveal what branches of Process Builder and Flow Logic have run?
Oh, so you're just firing off messages into the Chatter group, so actions in. Is that what you mean?
That's what it looks like when I'm reading it.
Yeah. So and some of the so if you can put just actions everywhere just to create messages in like a Chatter group that you're the only person that has access to. You can. I kind of usually just create maybe a logging object that nobody can see, and I just can log loads of different information within that. But yeah, the only thing is that it has to go through that evaluation to kind of get to it. And also, if you're pushing all these messages in all the time, then potentially your process builder processes could kind of start slowing down, or Chatter, But yeah, you could do it that way. Depends how big your implementation is, really.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things, you're spot on there, where it's like, if you've got a whole lot going, then maybe you don't want to add more to the automation to make it even more complicated.
Yeah. And then if you think you're expecting that message to come in and it doesn't, and you go to the process builder process and realize somebody hasn't put it in there in the first place. So yeah, it's kind of like swings and roundabouts a bit, really.
Those are good questions. We'll sit tight and see if anybody else has any other questions. So while we're waiting, we got one. So what does WF_rule_not_evaluated mean? So the workflow rule not evaluated in the debug log, I believe, is what Jamie's asking about.
There was, I'm just going to quick look. I'm just going to check the dictionary definition. I'm assuming because it skipped the evaluation because it didn't need to evaluate it because it's already evaluated. Does that make sense? I'll just have a quick check. Not.
That makes sense, and I think it looks like that's what Jamie was thinking it also.
Yeah. I think because it's already been evaluated, it doesn't have to reevaluate it. Oh, no, maybe the recursion bit, actually.
Oh,
yeah, so it occurs, so it occurs when the record update is not a subsequent edit. In other words, the record already met the workflow rule criteria prior to the edit. Yeah, so then it's not reevaluating it.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And so, yeah, it just says, pops that in there to say it's not reevaluating it.
Anybody else have any other questions? Maybe not exactly tied to debug log. Anything else? We got a little bit of time. If you've got any other automation related questions that are on your mind.
Francis, there was one that Jody had submitted via Twitter, and I don't know if you saw this, but her question was if you could answer the question about how to have Process Builder on an object that also has a block duplicate rule. That would be fabulous.
Yeah. Oh, yes, that one. I remember that one. So it's a bit. So basically, process builder is flow under the hood, and flow basically doesn't quite sit on the platform. So it's kind of running on the side. And a duplicate rule in Salesforce is basically under the hood. It's considered as a validation failure if you get a duplicate conflict. And so when you if you try and do something within flow that is like updating a record or creating a record that's going to hit a duplicate rule issue, then it's basically going to throw an error, and all that flow sees it as is a validation error, and it can't continue and it fails. So there's not a lot you can do to not allow it to fail. The only real thing you can do is basically, one of the ways is put a field on the record, which is kind of like bypass, duplicate rules, and which you do, and which you only fill out in the flow. And so that then it sets that the duplicate rule then doesn't fire because it's saying, hey, skip the duplicate rule for this scenario because it's being fired by a flow. And then you basically take that field, uncheck that field straight away afterwards. So it's kind of like, it's a bit of a hack, but it's kind of telling it, hey, you can create this record in this scenario because it is coming from a flow or a process builder process. But then you kind of switch it back to, oh, actually, if anybody else now updates it, it's going to get a duplicate error. So that's one way. It's a bit of a hacky way. The best way is to architect it such that it will never have that scenario happening. So.
Good. Corey has a question. What are some of the most common order of operations gotchas that you run into?
Oh, order. I think one of the classic ones is, I think I had one. So if I go back to that slide, I'll basically show you. Actually, I think I've got the old one, which might give you a bit more detail. Let's just dig it out. So because it's always in that order, I'll just switch my screen back on. So these are some of the many checks that it does, and it always does it in order. So one of the things could be that your triggers are basically changing the record values before it gets to your process builder processes, and something else in another process is changing it back. But when you run it, you're like, why isn't my process builder firing? But it's essentially because the trigger or something's setting the value. Your process builder then runs and goes, oh, wait a minute, this value should be set and it's not. And then another process builder fires off and resets the value back, which is a weird one. Also, workflow rules, and it can happen with workflow rules and process builder processes as well. So you set a value and it's just the order in which you're doing things. I think I had one customer, I think there was, they had a status change on a workflow rule. So by the time it got to the process builder process, it was different to what it was when it was created in the first place. And so the process builder process is basically kind of reordering things and saying, oh, actually don't update the field as a workflow, update it in the process builder process and move the process builder logic into the workflow and to kind of get the order correct. So yeah, there's little things like that that happen. But generally it's usually okay. What other ones have I had? But I think that's mainly it, updating fields or different rules changing the values. And by the time it gets to your process builder process, which is after all the workflow rules and the code, it could be something else. So
Jamie's question is, have you found that the logs provide detailed information when converting a lead? I have not tried it yet, but will need to, and I'm curious about your experience.
Oh, I don't think so. It used to be real pain, especially when you were converting a record to a lead, and especially in code, you couldn't access the conversion information or the lead details in the trigger or in the code, but you can now. But I've never had so it might. I don't know if it's all part, I think it will be all part of the same transaction. So yeah, it will be all part of the same transaction. So that information will be in there. It's just if you get the lead information in the debug, because you're potentially not, because you're changing the lead record. Yeah, you should get both the details in. So you should get all the lead information and you should get all the new records information as well, because it is an action being performed. But the lead convert is what we called Parker Harris's code. Potentially it's like really old code that was written millennia ago, which potentially doesn't bind to the same rules as everything else. So potentially I could be just lying, but I'll take a look, see if we get anything.
So Charles had a question. Any advice on doing multiple actions for a single object in a single process builder versus different processes for each action? Harder to turn on and off while developing if all actions are in a single process.
Yeah, so this is the kind of, it's a bit of a balancing act. The more process builder process you have, the slower everything's going to get, and the more potential issues you have platform side. So, time of execution errors, things like this. But so it's beneficial to have fewer process builder processes and more actions and criteria within a, say, single process builder process. But it becomes less manageable because you've now got, one monster of a process builder process, and it's kind of stopping the execution at points that you weren't expecting. So it's a bit of a balancing act. It's actually, I find it quite interesting now, because it's almost as process builder has kind of opened up, not Pandora's box, but kind of opened up a load more of the kind of core platform limits and things within it. So you kind of have to now kind of put more of a technical architect hat on when you're kind of designing this, and kind of decide, well, is this an object where I'm just going to have one process builder process? Or is it, am I going to split the process builder processes up, not by what they do, but maybe a department? So I'm going to call this one support. It's on the account object, but it just has all the support related process actions. And I'm going to have another process builder called sales, which is just the sales action. So you're kind of limiting the number, but breaking it up a little bit. But yeah, it's a bit of a balancing act. And yeah, it's kind of like admins becoming architects. Start doing the architect certifications. There we go. It's always good. I think all admins should start going through the architect certifications, because they should, definitely ripe for it.
So in terms of building a process on one object, I'm going to turn it over to David, because he came up with a really cool way to turn off some criteria nodes.
Yeah, so I've seen a few different things. I wrote a blog post, or actually kind of two, on trying to simplify it and streamline your process builder into one. You can use kind of two different ways to trigger things. The first one I think we had was Eric, who presented on it on Automation Hour, where you can put a node at the very top that is a way for you to not trigger a process builder as a whole. So you could have that fire and it does nothing. So like you send it out to a flow that has no action of updating or creating a record. And that allows you to stop that process builder if it meets certain criteria altogether, so nothing else could ever happen. The other option is, if you want to, say, turn off a specific action, you can either kind of create like either in like the custom label or custom, I think it was custom labels, right, Jen? Is it
a custom label or custom settings that you use?
Yeah, you can do those, and then you can also put fields on the actual object itself that you can reference to turn things on and off, depending on how you have it set up. So if you do either custom settings or labels or a field on the record, You can do that field as like a formula field, so it affects everything. And then you don't have like, because if it's just the default checkbox, like then that means that it could potentially run if like it's an existing record differently than if it's a new one. So you're able to, with the formula field, make it across everything. So I think either way will work, but if you create a field or a custom metadata like field for each different node that you would want to turn on and off, then you can turn off specific parts of your process builder for whatever reason without actually turning off your whole process builder, because that's one of the things, if you're trying to make changes, it can get difficult because you might not want to kind of break a different part of your process builder and you're only trying to really turn one piece off. So I think that kind of answers that.
Yeah, so you're kind of controlling what actions you want firing off or not based on the criteria. I always find that it gets more complicated when you have cascading things happening afterwards, because by switching off one, say, field update may stop other process builders from firing off, and you don't really know what's going on after. But I'm just having a look at the lead convert. I don't think I can see any field values on there. So no.
We got a question in that I think would be great for you, Francis. Can you describe what it would look like in the E-log if different processes are colliding?
So if there's an error. Also, yeah, so if you get an error, so if you, I'll see if I've got it on the old slide deck. I think I went through it in the last call. Let's have a quick look. So it depends what type of error it is. So if it's say a validation rule error or some kind of core platform thing that is kind of having a conflict, and you kind of get an error, if there's any error happens, the debug log just stops logging, essentially. So if you whiz right to the bottom of the debug log, you can basically see immediately what the issue is. So that's if it's kind of like a core fundamental error. If you're talking about a collision as in one is expecting a field to be filled out and therefore it doesn't execute its actions because it's been updated by another process builder process, and you want to kind of change the order or something like that? Or is it more kind of like an actual error like this?
She says, let's say a process can't get exclusive access to a record.
Yeah, so those kind of errors. So these are platform errors. So this is an example of one with a validation rule. So if I load up the debug log, so it's all in this corner, but essentially if you kind of change the perspective back to log view, you'll see it. But you can see at the bottom here, we've got wflow action error, and it gets an unhandled exception, unhandled fault occurred while processing the flow. And depending on what it is, you do get more information in here, but it's not much more than what you'd get in the email. But you might get the lock issues detail a bit more within here, because you might be able to see what field or what record, what's happened just before it being locked. So you might be able to see what other processes are kind of trying to use the same record potentially. So you might be able to determine which process it's potentially conflicting with. So you can basically go up a little bit and search for the ID of that record that's had the lock, and potentially kind of see if there's any other process builder processes or something else that is using that record and causing that lock issue. And therefore you can kind of re-architect the way your process builder processes fire off, and therefore it's only updated in the last process builder and not in both, for example. But you can actually, just copy out. So double click on here, copy the ID out, paste it in here, and it does a bit of a search to try and find it. If it doesn't find it, sometimes it doesn't find everything in here. And you can actually go to, if I dive in here, and if you just search for Debug Logs, oh, I haven't got any in there, but essentially, if I'm running a debug log, so you need to kind of get it running. So which one? User debug. So basically your name should appear in here. And if I just extend that to today. Now if I perform an action, so edit, save it. I refresh this. Oh, should have fired. Am I just doing? What's the time? 2019. Oh, did I put the wrong time on? 2020. Oh no, can we change the time? Whoops. It's a bit annoying, this. I usually use Debug Log now. Sorry, developer himself. But yeah, you basically have to set a time that it's kind of valid for, and it's your name. You basically track other people using this. So if somebody's got a problem and they're somewhere else and you don't have access to log in as them, you basically track them if you want using that and get a debug log from what they're doing. So save this. It should appear now. Oh, it's still not appearing. Not appearing. But yeah, you get a list in here. And this is basically a debug log all in text format. You can just do a search within the web browser if this search isn't working. So this is quite a tiny debug log, so I can double click on that, copy that out. Yeah, sometimes it doesn't search because it gets a bit broken. Something else. Smaller debug log. Yeah, there you go. So you can basically, if you've got the ID of that record that's come out in your email or whatever, you can then just basically search for it within here, and it'll if there's more entries, so if there's more kind of records that or process builder process that you're using it, you'll find it in here. You just click on the line, unclick the unfilter, and it'll jump to where it is in the debug log, and then you can scroll up a little bit to find out what it is. So this, I've just searched this ID randomly, and if I kind of come up with it, all this means nothing to me, nothing to me. Get to here, if I open this up. Oh, code unit started, Apex data source. Okay, this sounds like some Apex or some bit of code that's running. Oh, maybe it's something related to that, potentially. So yeah, you can kind of, yeah, use that to kind of find debug log. These are quite good. Oh, that loaded up. So yeah, so a good example is, let's have a look if we've got any, I haven't got really anything I can use. Actually, do this. So this is the current values for this record. So I can just basically pull out, oh, created by, let's pull loads of those, copy that. So if there's an issue with that record, paste it in there. Well, there we go, we've got 3. It's come up 3 times there. So if I just select the bottom one, actually that was the bottom one we were on, so we move up to that one. Oh, that's the update all accounts contacts. So it's being used in there. Go to the top one. Oh, yeah, top one. Scroll up. Oh, create UHD. So you can kind of see And this is only because it's part, it's the same created ID user that's appeared in the same field values for that particular record that Salesforce was evaluating as part of a flow. But at least then you can see that, say if I use the ID, I can then find out all the different flows that have fired off for that particular ID. Again, if it's evaluated true, well, that one's evaluated false, so it's not going to fire any actions off. I can keep on going through, but I find maybe one that says true, that's false as well, so that wouldn't have fired any actions off. So again, if there's no actions and it's not performing an update operation on that record, then it's not going to be the issue. This one's false as well. But yeah, you can have a hunt around. So yeah, that can be useful. It's really kind of zooming into the one, these events that, they're useful, and just ignoring all the rest. So that you'll get a lot of, if you've got a lot of code in your org, you'll get a lot of code event types, and you can reduce that if you want. So if you go debug, change log levels, and then this is the green because it's active at the moment, and that's also active, but it never worked. But if I go in there, you see here, these are kind of the levels of information you're going to get appearing in your debug log. So Apex, I got finest. So I get all the detail of all the code that's going on and firing off. But if you don't want to know anything about the code, if you wanted to, just turn it to error or warn. And then it will basically only give you messages in the logs if your Apex code has thrown an error or is warning you about something. But just be careful, because if you switch it off altogether, then it might be Apex that is throwing an error, but you'll just never see it in the log, and you'll be trying to figure out why this thing is going wrong, when in fact it's just you switched it off in the debug log, so you can't actually see the error anymore. But you can play around, and as well with the workflow, I have that on the finest setting, basically on finer, so I get the formula field, formula detail, criteria, and all that kind of stuff as well. But yeah, just click OK on that. It's all good.
All right.
Yep.
I think that takes us to the end of our time today. We got 1 minute left, unless there's any last minute questions. I guess we'll call it a webinar. Thanks so much, everybody, for attending today's webinar. Thanks so much, Francis, for putting on the awesome webinar and letting us all learn a whole lot more about debug logs.
Cool, yeah, no problem. Be great.
All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Bye.
See ya.